Need for Speed has always been remembered for its speed, its legendary cars, and its intense chases. But behind the roar of engines and the glow of city lights, there is something that almost never stands out at first glance. Over the years, the franchise has built its stories by leaving empty spaces, unsettling silences, and events that were simply never explained. The simplest explanation is that all of this is just a matter of writing choices or development limitations. But when the same patterns repeat game after game, city after city, doubt begins to creep in. What if these mysteries aren't mistakes at all? What if the Need for Speed universe is telling its story precisely through what it chooses not to show? As if there were an invisible layer behind the races, where decisions are made, destinies are sealed, and everything keeps happening far from the player's eyes. Today we're going to cross these zones of silence. Not to invent answers, but to observe the clues the games themselves left behind. 11 real mysteries present throughout the franchise that were never explained. When placed side by side, they don't feel like isolated cases. They feel like fragments of the same hidden narrative, a story that is never told in full but has always been there, running parallel to yours. 1. What happened to Razer after Carbon? At the end of Need for Speed Carbon, just when everything suggests the story has reached its definitive climax, something strange happens. Razer, the antagonist who stole the legendary BMW M3 GTR, is defeated, exposed, and humiliated in front of the entire city. The narrative logic of any racing game from that era would suggest a clear resolution: arrest, a spectacular escape, late redemption, or even a dramatic disappearance with some visual explanation. But Carbon offers none of that. Razer simply vanishes. There is no final scene, no dialogue, no consequence shown on screen. The character who fueled the protagonist's entire revenge arc ceases to exist the exact moment his narrative function is fulfilled. And this silence is not accidental. It establishes a pattern that would repeat across several other games in the franchise. Central characters disappear without explanation, as if the world of Need for Speed had blind spots, deliberate gaps where the story refuses to look. For years, Razer's fate remained an official void. No supplementary material, no hidden dialogue, no developer commentary ever clarified what happened after that night in Palmont. What makes this even more curious is that Carbon goes out of its way to show the impact of his actions beforehand. He loses everything: his car, his respect, his control over the city, but he does not lose his presence. The game cuts away precisely before showing any real consequence. Razer is not arrested on screen, does not escape, does not die, nor does he redeem himself. He simply stops being observed. It is as if, in that universe, disappearing is more common than dying. This pattern of absence, which begins here, is the same one we later see repeated with iconic cars, silent protagonists, and figures that drive the plot without ever appearing. The mystery deepens even further when, many years later, Razer returns in Need for Speed Unbound. He reappears older, changed, carrying a past the game deliberately chooses not to show. There is no direct reference to what he experienced between Carbon and Unbound. No definitive fall, no explicit rebuilding. Only the sense that something happened but remains beyond the player's reach.
But you're not the only one trying to get my attention, Sugar Plum.
This return, rather than closing the gap, expands the mystery. If Razer survived, where did he go? If he changed, what shaped him? And more importantly, why does the franchise choose not to tell this story? This narrative silence is not isolated. It functions almost like a warning. Need for Speed builds its universe not only through what it shows, but mainly through what it hides. Razer is the first major example of a character who falls from the top and crosses an invisible space within the saga's chronology. A space where events exist, but are never shown, where decisions are made off camera, where the player is deliberately excluded. From this point on, the franchise begins to treat time as fragmented and selective, and Razer's fate becomes the first piece of a larger puzzle. A universe where cars disappear without a trace, protagonists never show their faces, and fundamental figures never step into the frame. What happened to Razer after Carbon is not just a question about a specific villain. It is the first indication that, within Need for Speed, not all stories are meant to be concluded. Some are deliberately left in the dark, and once you realize that, you begin to notice that Razer was not the last to disappear. He was only the first. 2. The whereabouts of Tyler Morgan's Nissan Skyline. If Razer's disappearance marks the first great human void in the franchise's narrative, the vanishing of the Nissan Skyline in Need for Speed Payback deepens that same pattern of absence, now shifting the mystery to something that, within Need for Speed, often carries more identity than many characters: the car. In Payback's prologue, the player takes control of Tyler Morgan in a desperate escape through the streets of Fortune Valley behind the wheel of an iconic Nissan Skyline GTR, treated by the narrative with the same symbolic weight the BMW M3 GTR carried during the franchise's classic era. The scene is intense and cinematic, and it makes it clear that this car is not merely a means of transportation, but part of the protagonist's identity. It is there at the moment of the fall, at the point where everything goes wrong, just as the M3 GTR had been present at the beginning of the revenge story years earlier. And precisely because of that, its later absence becomes so strange. After the prologue, the story jumps forward in time, the characters split up, and the game begins again. Tyler returns to the streets, but the Skyline does not. Unlike other titles in the saga, where starter cars are recovered, mentioned, or explicitly replaced, Payback simply erases the Skyline from the narrative. There is no dialogue, no lost scene, no reference to confiscation, destruction, or betrayal. The car that opened the game, that stood at the center of the protagonist's downfall, ceases to exist within the story. It is not sold, not recovered, does not appear in future missions, nor is it cited as a memory. It vanishes in the exact same way Razer vanished, outside the player's field of vision. This detail gains even more weight when we realize that Payback is a game obsessed with cars that have history. Vehicles are treated as unique pieces, relics, objects of extreme desire. There is an entire plot revolving around thefts, dismantling operations, underground auctions, and mysterious collectors. Within that context, the silence surrounding the Skyline does not feel like an oversight. It feels like a choice. If cars represent memory, identity, and power, then the disappearance of a symbol like that cannot be irrelevant. It creates a gap similar to the one left by Razer. Something fundamental happened, but the game refuses to show it. And just as in Carbon, this void is not isolated. It directly reinforces the idea that, in the Need for Speed universe, certain events are never officially recorded. The player only sees the key moments. Everything that happens between them remains hidden. Tyler Morgan's Skyline comes to occupy the same narrative space Razer did years earlier, a central element that vanishes without explanation and leaves behind only questions. Who ended up with the car? Was it dismantled, sold, stored away, or simply erased from the story because remembering it would mean confronting a past the characters would rather forget? This pattern of erasure begins to form a larger picture. First, a villain disappears after his defeat. Then, an iconic car vanishes after a traumatic event. Both are tied to moments of rupture, collapse, and restart. Need for Speed seems to build its stories in cycles, yet refuses to show what happens in the interval between one cycle and the next. What exists in that invisible space is always the same thing: silence. And that silence becomes even more unsettling when we realize that Payback, more than any other game in the franchise, revolves around who controls the cars, who owns them, and who watches from the shadows. The Skyline does not disappear by accident. It vanishes precisely before the narrative introduces figures who collect, control, and manipulate everything behind the scenes, as if that car had crossed an invisible line, leaving the player's story and entering a deeper layer of the Need for Speed world. A layer where not everything is shown, not everything is said, and where certain elements, just like Razer before it, simply stop being seen. And when something stops being seen in this universe, it rarely means that it has ceased to exist. 3. Who the mysterious collector from Payback really is. If the disappearance of the Skyline already suggests that certain cars cross an invisible boundary within the Need for Speed universe, the third mystery reveals who may be standing on the other side of that boundary, silently observing everything. In Need for Speed Payback, the figure known only as the Collector emerges as an almost abstract presence. He doesn't race, doesn't appear in chases, and never exposes himself on the streets. And yet, nothing in Fortune Valley seems to happen without somehow passing through him. Legendary cars vanish, reappear dismantled, surface in secret auctions, or are treated as pieces of a private museum. And at the center of this system stands someone who never shows his face, never reveals his name, and never explains his motivations. The Collector is not a traditional villain. He is a void with power. Unlike classic antagonists in the franchise who confront the player directly, the Collector operates at a distance. He doesn't need to accelerate because he controls those who do. He doesn't need to get his hands dirty because he owns people, cars, and destinies. His identity is never officially confirmed, but the game deliberately builds a symbolic trail around him. A man too rich to appear, too influential to be ignored, and too invisible to be held accountable. Within Payback's narrative logic, he functions almost like an entity, someone who watches events from above, as if he were outside the game itself, yet still determining everything that happens within it. This is where an old community theory gains strength and begins to connect different eras of the franchise. Many players believe the Collector could be Darius, the former final boss of Carbon. The idea doesn't come from nowhere. Darius was always portrayed as someone above the streets, above the crews, and above racing itself. He didn't need to prove anything because he already controlled everything. In Carbon, he watches the protagonist rise, conquer territories, and gain respect, only to intervene at the exact right moment. His car, his status, and his demeanor always positioned him as distant, cold, and strategic, exactly like the Collector in Payback. What's most unsettling about this possible connection isn't the identity itself, but the pattern it reinforces. If Razer disappeared after his defeat and the Skyline vanished after Tyler's fall, the Collector represents the opposite. He never falls. He never appears only to disappear later. He exists solely as a continuous presence, as someone who was always there, even when the player couldn't see him. This suggests that the Need for Speed universe isn't driven only by visible racers and villains, but by figures who operate outside the field of view, accumulating power while others fight over scraps in the streets. Within this logic, the disappearance of the Skyline stops being an isolated mystery and begins to make sense. In a game where cars are treated as works of art and symbols of power, nothing vanishes by accident. If there is someone who collects, dismantles, and controls legendary vehicles, then some cars aren't lost. They're absorbed. They leave the player's narrative and become part of an invisible collection, guarded by someone who sees value where others see only speed. The Skyline may never be mentioned again because once captured by this system, it no longer belongs to the protagonist's story. The Collector, therefore, is not just a mysterious character. He is the embodiment of the same silence that surrounds Razer and the Skyline. While some disappear after losing everything, others exist precisely because they never need to appear. He represents the top of an invisible pyramid within the Need for Speed universe, where those at the bottom race, lose, flee, and vanish, and those at the top observe, accumulate, and remain. And so, Payback reinforces a disturbing idea. Perhaps the greatest power in this world isn't winning races, but never being seen racing at all. This mystery further amplifies the sense that the franchise builds its mythology out of calculated absences. Characters who vanish without explanation, cars that disappear without a trace, and now a central figure whose identity is never revealed. Everything points to the same narrative destination, a universe where the player only ever sees part of the story. The rest unfolds in the shadows, controlled by someone who, like the Collector, chooses to remain invisible. And the more invisible he is, the more powerful he seems to be. 4. The identity of Sergeant Cross's partner. If up to this point the mysteries revolve around who disappears and who watches from a distance, Need for Speed, Most Wanted introduces a different kind of narrative void, someone who is always present but never truly seen. Throughout the entire game, Sergeant Cross appears as the embodiment of relentless pursuit. He is the face of the police, the voice of constant threat, the final obstacle between the player and freedom. Yet almost always at his side, there is a figure that defies any attempt at explanation. A female officer who accompanies him in multiple scenes, takes part in key dialogues, and shares strategic decisions, but who never receives a name, never gets a backstory, and never gains an identity of her own. She is there, she speaks, she reacts, she influences, but officially, she doesn't exist. This partner of Cross is not just background detail. She shows up in crucial moments of the narrative, including some of the most important cutscenes, functioning as a direct extension of police authority. And still, the game never formally introduces her. No profile, no external reference, no mention in promotional materials. She isn't treated as a playable character, a villain, or an ally. She occupies an in-between space, the same narrative space where Razer vanished after his defeat and where Tyler Morgan's Skyline stopped being mentioned. The difference is that here, the mystery isn't disappearance, it's presence without identity. This kind of narrative choice reinforces a pattern that becomes increasingly clear throughout the franchise. Need for Speed seems comfortable creating figures who fulfill essential roles without ever becoming complete individuals. Just as the collector controls everything without showing his face, Cross's partner represents an authority without a story. She is the system speaking, not a person. Her lack of a name doesn't feel accidental but symbolic. Giving her a name would humanize her, and humanizing would mean admitting flaws, motivations, and limits. Keeping her anonymous turns her into something bigger, almost institutional, as if she were less a specific officer and more the embodiment of constant surveillance. That reading becomes even more unsettling when we look at Cross's fate at the end of the game. He loses, falls from grace, and disappears from the main narrative, following the same path Razer would take years later. But his partner isn't even granted that kind of ending. She doesn't fall, doesn't flee, isn't punished, and isn't redeemed. She simply stops being seen the moment the story no longer needs her, as if she fulfilled her function and returned to the same invisible place she came from. The pattern repeats. Characters aren't concluded, they're switched off. Within the broader logic of Need for Speed's shared universe, this anonymous figure reinforces the idea that there are forces moving through different stories without ever being fully revealed. While racers change, cars are lost, and villains collapse, certain presences remain constant, always out of focus. Cross's partner may not be remembered by name, but her existence raises an essential question. How many other important characters pass through these games without ever having their stories told? Just as the collector watches without appearing, and just as certain cars vanish without explanation, this officer represents something beyond an individual. She symbolizes the system that is always there, tracking, watching, acting, yet never exposing itself enough to be questioned. Need for Speed isn't only telling stories about speed and escape. It's building a world where true power rarely has a face, rarely has a name, and almost never gets explained. And Sergeant Cross's partner is one of the first clues that, in this universe, what matters most isn't always who stands on the front line, but who stays in the shadows, following everything in silence. 5. Mercer's final fate. If in Most Wanted Authority manifests as a presence without a name, in Need for Speed, Heat the mystery reaches its most explicit point, precisely when the narrative chooses to stop showing. The final fate of Lieutenant Mercer is one of the most abrupt and unsettling cuts in the entire franchise. Throughout the game, Mercer is not just a common corrupt cop. He is the face of a completely rotten system, someone who manipulates evidence, controls illegal races, extorts racers, and turns the law into a personal weapon. Everything in Heat revolves around taking this man down, exposing his crimes, and making him fall. And when that moment finally arrives, the game chooses silence. In the final scene involving Mercer, he is cornered, defeated, without allies, and without an escape. Ava Torres points her gun, the tension escalates, and everything suggests the decisive moment has arrived. But instead of showing the consequence, the screen cuts to black. No gunshot is heard, no arrest is confirmed, no death is shown. The game simply refuses to answer the most obvious question. Did Mercer die? Was he arrested? Did he escape? Did he survive to continue operating in the shadows? Just like Razer and Carbon, he disappears at the exact moment when his story should be concluded. This cut is not merely a stylistic choice. It reinforces a pattern that, by this point, has become impossible to ignore. In Need for Speed, central characters rarely receive clear endings. They vanish, are switched off from the narrative, pushed outside the player's field of view. Mercer, despite all his importance, receives the same treatment as Razer, Cross, and even invisible figures like the Collector. When they stop being useful to the immediate story, they aren't closed. They're concealed. What's most disturbing in this case is what Mercer represents. Unlike street racers or underground villains, he is the official system. He wears a uniform, a badge, and institutional power. Showing his death or his arrest would mean asserting that the system itself can be defeated. Cutting the scene before the resolution preserves ambiguity. Maybe Mercer was punished. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe another Mercer took his place the very next day. The game doesn't answer, because within this logic, the problem was never just one man. It was something larger, more diffuse, and harder to destroy. This ambiguity directly echoes the anonymous partner of Cross and the invisible collector of Payback. All of them represent different expressions of the same concept, power that never fully exposes itself. Mercer may fall, but what he symbolizes remains. Just as the nameless officer didn't need an identity to exist, Mercer doesn't need an explicit ending to continue haunting the world of Heat. His final absence is just as significant as his presence throughout the game. By leaving Mercer's fate unresolved, Need for Speed, Heat reinforces the feeling that there are stories the player will never see to the end, that certain conflicts aren't resolved in a final race or a conclusive cutscene. They simply exit the stage, as if they continue unfolding somewhere off-screen. This same narrative device had already been used with characters and cars, but here it reaches a more uncomfortable level, because it touches directly on the idea of justice. Mercer doesn't disappear because he is forgotten. He disappears because the story chooses not to look beyond that point. And when we add this silence to Razer's disappearance, the collector's hidden identity, and the police presence without a name, it becomes clear that Need for Speed builds its universe out of carefully placed gaps. Gaps that suggest that behind the races, there is a much larger world, one that keeps functioning continuously, even when the player is no longer watching. 6. Who Ryan Cooper really is. After characters who vanish, authorities without faces, and villains whose fate is hidden at the last second, Need for Speed. Pro Street takes that pattern to an even more radical level by turning the protagonist himself into a mystery. Ryan Cooper is the only central character in the franchise who is present the entire time and, even so, is never truly known. He doesn't speak, has no explicit past, shows no stated motivations, and never reveals his face. His helmet stays closed from start to finish, as if the narrative insists on constantly reminding you that you're not following an ordinary person here, but an abstract figure, a symbol in motion. Unlike the protagonists of Underground, Most Wanted, and Carbon, who at least react to the world around them, Ryan Cooper is almost a silent entity. He arrives, competes, wins everything, and leaves. He doesn't form bonds, doesn't build deep personal rivalries, and leaves no emotional trace behind. Even in a game that presents itself as more realistic, focused on legal racing, mechanical damage, and official championships, the central character remains wrapped in the same silence that already marked so many other elements of the franchise. Pro Street talks about professionalization, but refuses to professionalize its protagonist on a narrative level. This silence doesn't feel accidental. In a universe where villains disappear after defeat and figures of power operate off-screen, Ryan Cooper represents the opposite end of the equation. If the collector watches from above and Mercer manipulates the system from within, Cooper simply passes through it all without ever truly integrating. He wins championships, breaks records, and defeats legendary names, yet never becomes part of that world. He moves through it. And when everything ends, there is no farewell scene, no public coronation, no explicit continuation. He vanishes exactly the way he entered, without explanation. That behavior reinforces a question that runs through the entire golden era of Need for Speed. Who, ultimately, is the protagonist of this saga? The franchise has never officially confirmed whether the character from Underground, Most Wanted, Carbon, and Pro Street is the same person, but the way Ryan Cooper is handled suggests something even more unsettling. Maybe it isn't a specific person at all. Maybe it's an archetype, a racer who appears when the system needs to be challenged, wins everything, and disappears before being absorbed by it. A ghost of speed. Ryan Cooper's lack of identity echoes the narrative pattern we've already seen repeat. Just as Cross's partner has no name because she represents authority, Cooper has no face because he represents the pure racer, stripped of past, future, or ties. He can't be corrupted like Mercer, can't be watched like the Collector, and can't fall from grace like Razer because he doesn't fully belong to that world. He exists only as long as the race exists. That detail becomes even more relevant when we look at what comes next. Pro Street marks a rupture in the franchise. From that point forward, the games begin treating protagonists as more defined characters, with names, backstories, and clear conflicts. Ryan Cooper ends up isolated in time, like a narrative anomaly, an absolute champion who never speaks, never explains himself, and never returns. Even when other characters from the classic era reappear years later, Cooper remains absent. No mention, no direct reference, no explicit legacy. So, the mystery around Ryan Cooper isn't just about who he is, but what he represents within the Need for Speed universe. He is the most complete embodiment of the pattern the franchise established early on. Stories that move forward without looking back, characters that exist without needing to be explained, and a world where not even the protagonist needs an identity to fulfill his role. And when a game chooses to turn its hero into a silent enigma, it reinforces the idea that, in this universe, what mattered most was never who was racing, but the act of racing itself. Everything else, like Razer, Mercer, and so many others, ends up swallowed by the same silence that ties all these mysteries together. 7. The invisible existence of Alec. If in Pro Street the protagonist exists without a face, in Need for Speed, Unbound the narrative goes even further and builds its entire story around someone who simply does not exist on screen. Alec is the starting point of Unbound. Because of him, everything collapses. Trust is broken, the protagonist loses everything, and a complete restart becomes inevitable. Without Alec, there is no plot, no downfall, no revenge, and yet he never appears. He has no face, no voice, no physical presence. Alec exists only through mention, memory, and accusation. He lives exclusively in the words of other characters and in the consequences of what he did. This narrative choice is extreme, but perfectly consistent with the pattern the franchise has been building for years. If Razer disappears after fulfilling his role, if the Skyline vanishes after Tyler's fall, and if the Collector controls everything without ever being seen, Alec represents the final evolution of this logic. He doesn't even need to enter the scene to move the story forward. His absence is so complete that it becomes more powerful than any physical presence. He is the void that triggers everything. What's most unsettling is that, despite never appearing, Alec seems to know exactly when to act. He betrays at the right moment, disappears at the right moment, and is never directly confronted by the player. There is no final chase, no decisive race, no reckoning. The game offers no catharsis. Alec does not fall like Razer, is not exposed like Mercer, and is not defeated like classic antagonists. He simply stops being mentioned as the story progresses, as if he had returned to the same invisible place he came from. This deliberate absence connects Alec directly to the Collector from Payback. Both are figures who operate off-screen, yet completely shape the world around them. Both manipulate cars, destinies, and relationships without ever exposing themselves. And just as the Collector may have absorbed legendary cars like the Skyline, Alec absorbs something even more valuable: trust. He breaks the bond between characters and disappears, taking with him everything that had been built before. Within this larger logic, Alec feels less like an individual and more like a symptom, a product of a universe where nothing is permanent, where cars, villains, protagonists, and even allies can vanish without warning. His physical non-existence reinforces the sense that Need for Speed is more interested in consequences than in causes. It doesn't matter who he is, where he came from, or where he went. What matters is the hole he leaves behind. This pattern becomes even clearer when we look at the franchise's chronology as a whole. Visible characters disappear, invisible characters control events, protagonists lack faces, and villains lack definitive endings. Alec fits perfectly into this mosaic of absences. He is proof that, in the Need for Speed universe, you don't need to exist to be essential. You only need to act once and then vanish. And so, Unbound closes a cycle that began many years earlier, when Razer was defeated and simply erased from the narrative. Between one and the other, the franchise built a world where silence is as important as speed, and where what is not shown often matters more than what appears on screen. Alec doesn't appear because he doesn't need to. His absence already says everything. 8. The disappearance of Darius's Toyota Supra. After characters who vanish without leaving traces and figures who never even exist on screen, Need for Speed. Carbon hides one of the quietest, and at the same time, most revealing, narrative cuts in the entire franchise. The disappearance of Darius's Toyota Supra isn't just a visual curiosity, but a direct fracture in the continuity of the story. At the beginning of Carbon, after the fall in Palmont, the protagonist escapes the city behind the wheel of Darius's Toyota Supra. The scene is clear, explicit, and loaded with symbolism. That car represents escape, transition, the exact moment the character leaves behind everything he built. And yet, when the story moves forward and the player takes control again, something doesn't add up. The protagonist arrives in the new city driving the BMW M3 GTR, as if the Supra never existed. The game offers absolutely no explanation for this swap. There is no dialogue, no intermediate scene, no mention of loss, sale, trade, or destruction. The Supra simply stops existing inside the narrative. Just like the Skyline in Payback, it vanishes the moment it fulfills its symbolic function. It takes the protagonist out of chaos, and once that is done, it disappears from the world. That silence becomes even stranger when you remember the Supra isn't just any car. It belongs to Darius, the character who was always one step above everyone else, watching, manipulating, and intervening only when he chose to. That detail completely changes how the mystery reads. If the Supra was Darius's, why was the protagonist driving it in the first place? And more importantly, why does the game go out of its way not to show what happened afterward? The lack of explanation opens the door to an unsettling interpretation. Maybe the Supra was never truly taken. Maybe it was temporarily handed over, like a piece on a larger chessboard, and once it served its purpose, it simply returned to the control of whoever had always been at the top. Under that logic, the car's disappearance stops looking like a narrative mistake and starts reading like a clue. This pattern connects directly to the collector in Payback, a man who accumulates rare cars, controls destinies, and watches everything from a distance. Darius always carried that same profile. He doesn't race because he doesn't need to. He watches, he waits, he owns. The Supra vanishing without explanation reinforces the idea that certain cars, like certain characters, don't truly belong to the player's narrative. They pass through it, shape events, and then return to the invisible space where real control happens. By arriving in the new city with the BMW M3 GTR, the protagonist seems to have skipped an entire chapter of his own story, a chapter the player never gets to see. What happened between the escape and the arrival? Who made the swap? Why does no one comment on it? That gap echoes every other one we've already seen. Razer disappears after losing everything. Mercer vanishes at the decisive moment. Ryan Cooper wins it all and is never explained. Alec drives the plot without ever existing. And now, a legendary car simply evaporates from the timeline. What's most revealing is that Carbon never tries to correct it. The game moves forward as if nothing is wrong, as if that empty space were a natural part of that world. And maybe it is. Need for Speed often treats its narrative intervals like forbidden zones, places where important things happen, but the player isn't meant to see them. Darius's Supra belongs precisely to that space, a symbol of transition that vanishes because its continuity would reveal something the franchise prefers to keep hidden. This mystery reinforces the sense that the Need for Speed universe isn't linear or transparent. It's fragmented, selective, full of blind spots. Certain characters enter and exit without explanation. Certain cars appear only when convenient, and certain connections are suggested but never confirmed. The Supra's disappearance isn't an error, it's a pattern that makes it clear that, in this world, not everything that moves is under the player's control. Some things belong to larger, invisible forces operating outside the race, outside the camera, and outside the story we're shown. 9. The mysterious city in the background of Carbon. If the disappearance of cars and characters already suggests that there are intentional gaps in the narrative, Need for Speed Carbon presents perhaps the most literal example of everything the franchise chooses not to explain. In multiple moments throughout the game, during races, cinematic scenes, or wider shots of the city, a second city appears in the distance. It isn't Palmont. The architecture is different. The terrain doesn't match the playable map, and its presence creates the feeling that there is something beyond the limits of the world the player can access. For years, that far-off skyline fueled theories, debates, and speculation. Many believed it was part of a cut area, a hidden map, a canceled expansion, or even a direct connection to other titles in the franchise. What's strange is that Carbon never officially acknowledges this city within the narrative. No character mentions it, no mission points toward it, no race ever gets close to that space. It is always there, visible but unreachable, exactly like Razer after his defeat, exactly like Darius's Supra after the escape, exactly like all the elements that fulfill a function and are then pushed outside the field of interaction. The city in the background isn't a technical error noticed only by the most obsessive players. It's far too visible for that. It's positioned in a way that feels almost provocative, as if the game wants to constantly remind you that the world doesn't end where the map ends. Years later, developers confirmed that the city was just a background texture, a visual resource with no narrative intention. But that technical explanation, instead of closing the mystery, ended up reinforcing something even more interesting. Even when there is no planned story, Need for Speed creates spaces that feel meaningful. The franchise builds worlds that suggest continuity beyond what is shown, even if that continuity doesn't exist in any concrete way. The result is a universe that always seems larger than it truly is. Within the logic that has been repeating since the beginning, this unreachable city becomes the perfect representation of what the player cannot access. It exists only to be seen, never to be touched. Just as the collector watches without being confronted, just as Alec acts without appearing, and just as Ryan Cooper moves through the world without ever belonging to it, this distant city represents everything that sits outside the main race. It is a constant reminder that the Need for Speed universe has artificial limits, but also shadow zones. What makes it even more symbolic is that this city appears in Carbon, a game obsessed with territory, domination, and control. Every street you claim, every area you take over, every crew you defeat reinforces the idea that you are taking possession of the city. And yet, on the horizon, there is a space that can never be conquered, a territory that isn't part of the dispute. It simply watches, still, silent, untouchable, as if the game itself were saying that no matter how much you win, there will always be something beyond your reach. That distant city also connects directly to the franchise's idea of a shared universe. If there are places we can see but never visit, then maybe there are stories happening without us. Maybe characters disappear not because they stop existing, but because they cross through those invisible spaces between one game and the next. The background city in Carbon starts to function almost like a visual metaphor for all the narrative gaps the saga has built over the years. A place where Razer could have gone, where the Supra could have returned, where the collector could operate, where stories keep unfolding without the player. Even if it is only a texture, it became one of the most discussed elements in the franchise precisely because it speaks to what Need for Speed does so often. Show without explaining, suggest without confirming, create the feeling that there is something beyond, even when there isn't. And maybe that's exactly what makes this mystery so powerful. It doesn't matter whether that city was ever real inside the game's code. It was real inside the player's experience. It fed questions, theories, and connections. And in a universe where silence is a constant narrative tool, that invisible city is just one more proof that, in Need for Speed, what stays off-screen can be just as important as what's happening in the race. 10. The shared universe of Need for Speed. After cities that exist only on the horizon and stories that seem to continue beyond the player's reach, one inevitable question rises to the surface. Does all of this happen in the same world? The ninth mystery isn't tied to a specific character or a lost car, but to the very structure of the franchise itself. Over the years, Need for Speed has increasingly suggested that its games aren't just isolated stories, but fragments of a single narrative universe. Cross-references, recurring characters, indirectly mentioned events, and even legendary cars that reappear create the sense that everything belongs to a larger timeline, even if that timeline is never officially drawn. This idea is never directly confirmed by the developers, but it's constantly reinforced through details. Characters who appear in one game are mentioned in another. Familiar names return years later, older, changed, carrying a past the player never witnessed. Razer reappears in Unbound without his earlier fate ever being clarified. Cross vanishes after Most Wanted, yet his shadow remains as a reference to a type of authority that never truly disappears. The BMW M3 GTR crosses generations as if it were a historical artifact within that world. These elements don't behave like simple fan service. They fit together like pieces of a much larger setting. What makes it more intriguing is that this possible shared universe is never explained, only implied. There is no clear official chronology, no dates, no global maps, no declared connections. What exists instead are gaps filled by silence, and that silence connects directly to everything we've seen so far. If characters vanish without explanation, if cars disappear and reappear in different contexts, and if cities exist beyond the playable map, then it makes sense that the world itself would be fragmented. We aren't following the entire story, only selected segments of it. Within that logic, each game works like a temporary window into this universe. The player enters, lives a cycle of rise, collapse, and victory, and then exits, while the world keeps running. Characters who don't appear in one game may be acting somewhere else. Cars that vanish may be circulating in another city. Figures like the Collector could be moving through multiple stories without ever being fully revealed. All of it reinforces the feeling that Need for Speed doesn't tell complete stories. It tells episodes. That concept helps explain why so many questions are never answered. If everything happens in the same universe, then there is no need to close every arc inside a single game. Razer can disappear because his story continues off-screen. Mercer may never get a clear fate because the system he represents remains active somewhere else. Ryan Cooper may never be explained because maybe he doesn't belong to a fixed point on the timeline. Maybe he is only a manifestation of that world at a specific moment. A shared universe also changes the player's experience. You stop being just the protagonist of an isolated story and become someone moving through a larger world filled with blind spots. With each game, the player sees only what they are allowed to see. The rest stays hidden, running in the background. That's why Need for Speed never seems worried about tying up every loose end. The mystery isn't a mistake. It's part of the identity of the universe. And the further the franchise goes, the clearer it becomes that these connections aren't accidental. They create a sense of continuity that supports all the previous mysteries. A world where villains don't get endings, heroes don't show faces, cars don't have a known whereabouts, and cities exist beyond the map. All of that only truly makes sense if we accept that Need for Speed has always been telling the same story, just from different angles. A story that is never shown in full because the real thread running through the franchise isn't speed, but what happens outside the race. 11. The origin of the BMW M3 GTR and the protagonist of the Golden Era. If all these mysteries feel like loose fragments of the same reality, the last one works as the final link that ties together the franchise's Golden Era, in Need for Speed. Most Wanted, the BMW M3 GTR isn't just a powerful car, it's treated like an absolute symbol. A near-mythical object, recognized, desired, and feared by everyone. And yet, the more importance the game gives to that car, the less it explains its origin. It never shows how the protagonist got it, where it came from, who built it, or why it already appears fully ready, legendary, above any other vehicle. The BMW M3 GTR simply exists, as if it had always belonged to that world. That silence becomes even stranger when we remember that the franchise usually builds its stories around ascent. In Need for Speed Underground, the player starts from nothing. In Need for Speed Underground 2, that journey continues, with gradual recognition and clear growth. But in Most Wanted, the protagonist arrives at the top. He isn't trying to prove himself. He already is someone. Everyone knows him by the car he drives. And when Razer betrays him and steals the M3 GTR, it doesn't feel like a purely material loss. It feels like someone taking the very thing that defines the character's identity. The problem is that this identity is never officially confirmed. The franchise never clarifies whether the protagonist of Underground, Underground 2, Most Wanted, Carbon, and Pro Street is the same person. There is no name, no face, no formal history. What exists is a sequence of patterns, the same absurd talent, the same rapid rise, the same ability to vanish and start over in another city, and above all, the constant link to cars that become symbols bigger than their owners. The M3 GTR is simply the most obvious of them. When the protagonist loses the BMW in Most Wanted and flees the city, he resurfaces in Carbon trying to rebuild everything. When he flees again, he shows up with another legendary car with no explanation. In Pro Street, a faceless driver dominates everything and then disappears. The pattern repeats so many times that it begins to suggest something larger. Maybe we aren't following one specific person, but an archetype, a racer who moves through cities, eras, and systems, always appearing when the balance needs to be broken. Within that reading, the origin of the BMW M3 GTR is never explained because it doesn't matter. The car isn't the consequence of a previous story. It's the trigger. It marks the start of a cycle. Just as Darius's Supra appears only to enable escape, just as the Skyline exists mainly to mark Tyler Morgan's fall, the M3 GTR appears as the symbol of something that was already in motion before the player even takes control. It doesn't need an origin because it is the starting point. That interpretation also helps explain why the protagonist is never fully defined. Giving him a face, a name, or a concrete past would break this logic. He would stop being an element that moves through the Need for Speed universe and become just another character locked into a specific timeline. By keeping him undefined, the franchise preserves the idea of invisible continuity. The same racing spirit manifesting in different places, under different names, behind different cars, but always with the same impact. The BMW M3 GTR then stops being just an iconic car and becomes the ultimate symbol of that era. It represents everything Need for Speed never fully explains. Power without a clear origin, prestige without a told history, an object that crosses games, memories, and generations as if it were bigger than any single narrative. Just as Razer vanishes, just as Mercer's fate is hidden, just as the collector watches from a distance and Alec never appears, the M3 GTR exists in a space where explanations aren't required. In the end, this mystery doesn't close the story, it completes it. The origin of the BMW M3 GTR and the identity of the Golden Era protagonist remain open because that has always been the essence of Need for Speed. A universe built from absences, silences, and gaps. A world where the player never sees everything, where stories begin in the middle, end before the end, and continue somewhere off-screen. And maybe that's exactly why these games still spark so many questions, because deep down, Need for Speed never wanted to tell you everything. It wanted you to feel that there was always something else happening at high speed, just beyond what your eyes can catch.